News Talk is online. News Talk Online, a production of Paltalk.com, syndicated by CRN Digital Talk Radio. You can find us at the Paltalk News Network website, reportergary.com, where you can find stories that you may or may not see, hear, or read in the mainstream media. Go there early and often, just like voting in Chicago. There is a new documentary film out it's about to come out, called Iranium. You know, Iran and uranium, they put it together. It's a documentary about Iran's nuclear weapons aspirations. And it is a documentary, ladies and gentlemen, that the Iranian government does not want you to see. Now, how do I know this? Because the Iranian government urged the government of Canada to not screen the film at a government screening house in Toronto. And what happened was they said, well, we're going to screen it anyway. And there was a suspicious package and threats phoned in, so they evacuated the place, and the screening was not held. So to me, this only tells me that there are things in this film, obviously, that the Iranian government does not want the public to know. Before we get to our guest, Clare Lopez, who is a former CIA analyst with a lot of expertise in this area, I want to play a trailer, a 90-second trailer about the film to set the stage. So, Sean, if you could play that, that would be great.
Iranians clashed, shouting death to the dictator.
You have thousands of people rounded up, some because they demonstrate, some because they blog.
The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students.
You had attacks in Beirut, Buenos Aires, Khobar Towers, Nairobi, and Dar es Salaam. Iran has not been very subtle about confronting us in Iraq.
The Iranians are helping train Taliban fighters inside Iran.
Iran is the leading sponsor and supporter of terrorism around the world.
When they provide training and equipment to people fighting us, you'd have to say that they are at war with us.
Nuclear experts have found unexplained traces of plutonium and highly enriched uranium.
Islamic Republic of Iran will not stop its enrichment activities.
The Iranian government has failed to live up to its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Once the Iranian missiles are up and running on launching pads in Lebanon, they can reach Western targets.
When Mahmoud Ahmadinejad talks about a world without America not only being desirable but achievable, he could mean probably one thing.
People discount it because it's so hideous.
پیام انقلاب پیام جهانی است. همه قله‌های جهان رو فتح خواهد کرد.
Democracy inside Iran is a question now of international security.
I could tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I screened the film. Thankfully, the Iranian government was unaware of that, or they might have planted a suspicious package outside my house. Joining us to tell us about this, the threat that Iran actually is to not just the region, but obviously to the rest of the world, is Clare Lopez. Clare Lopez is a strategic policy and intelligence expert with a focus on the Middle East, national defense, weapons of mass destruction, and counter-terrorism issues. Her specific areas of expertise include Islam and Iran. She began her career as an operations officer with the Central Intelligence Agency. Was there for 20 years, now a private consultant. She serves as vice president of the non-profit forum, the Intelligence Summit, and is a professor at the Center for Counterintelligence and Security Studies. Clare Lopez, welcome to News Talk Online on the Paltalk News Network.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Glad to have you with us. Now, I got to say that when we booked this interview, we had no idea that events would dictate that I ask you not about the movie specifically, but about contemporary issues relating to the movie, and that, of course, has to do with the formation of a new government in Lebanon, headed by a prime minister who is a Hezbollah fella, and from what I have read and analyzed myself leading up to today's events, and certainly after viewing the movie, I have personally great cause for concern about a surrogate of Iran being in control of the government in Lebanon, and I presume you do as well.
Absolutely. The circumstances that led up to today did not happen overnight. This day has been a long time coming, when Iran essentially achieved hegemony over the country of Lebanon. But we saw the beginning of the power moves by Hezbollah, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Iran, of the Iranian IRGC, when they made their move back in 2008 to take over the city of Beirut and the country as a whole. They showed their power then, and it's only been a matter of time, to come to this date when they actually achieve political control by dominating the cabinet and it appears now the prime minister as well.
Indeed, and what's really interesting, you just said something very important, Clare Lopez, that this was a long time in coming. And the news cycle, as it has become, is like an instant gratification news cycle. Today's big story is forgotten tomorrow. And I think that is what is so important, frankly, about the film Iranium, because it takes things that, of course, we all know historically to be true, but puts them all together. For example, the attack on the Israeli embassy and later on the Israeli Jewish Center in Argentina. I mean, these guys that are running this government in Iran, their protestations to the contrary are not nice people at all.
No, not at all. What you have to realize is that this is a totalitarian regime. It's a jihadist state dedicated to Islamic jihad per the words of its own constitution, and very much dedicated to enmity, hostility, and even genocide towards the state of Israel. And yes, when you were talking about the attacks in Buenos Aires that took place in 1992 and then 1994, two separate truck bombing attacks, carried out by Hezbollah, and at the direct orders of the supreme leader of Iran, and that is Ali Khamenei, and the president at that time of Iran, who was the one that some people like to call the moderate, Hashemi Rafsanjani, was president then. But the task handed off to Hezbollah to carry out. That worldwide span, that worldwide presence of Hezbollah is very much concerning, because they're not just in the Middle East. They're in Europe, they're in North and Central and South America, especially establishing a beachhead of military and intelligence outpost in Venezuela as we speak.
Right, which is very disconcerting. I guess I've used that word before, but it is, once again. And you mentioned the supreme leader, Khamenei, and it's interesting because there is a famous quote by Ahmadinejad in which he talks about wiping Israel off the map. And there are those who say, if you don't understand Farsi, you are misinterpreting what he was saying about the state of Israel. But if you look at some of the public pronouncements by Khamenei that were documented and shown during this documentary, you could see that he says in absolutely unambiguous terms that Iran wants Israel eliminated, full stop.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anytime you hear the president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, speak, people should understand that he is a figurehead, he is a president, but he doesn't actually have the power. And that means that whatever he says, though, is actually approved by the supreme leader, who gets that title for a reason, Khamenei. And yeah, he, as well as other members of the Iranian regime, have repeatedly called for the elimination of the state of Israel, the destruction of the state of Israel, likening it to worms and germs and who knows what. It's speaking in stark, Jew hatred terms that are absolutely despicable. There's no question what they mean.
What happens, by the way, before we get to the callers, to the Christians and the Druze in Lebanon with the formation of this Hezbollah-controlled government there?
Well, what has happened is that the demographics in Lebanon have shifted over the decades, and Lebanon has always been a multi-confessional state, as they say, made up of Christians, Jews, Druze, Sunni, and Shiite Muslims, but the percentages have shifted, and now the Muslims, combined Sunni and Shiite, outnumber the others. And the Shiites, of course, are the population that traditionally felt themselves to be marginalized, and it was out of that population, out of that community that Hezbollah arose, is very much of the people of Lebanon, of the Shiite population of Lebanon, which, as I say, is growing in numbers while, relatively speaking, the percentage of Christians and Jews has diminished. And that's the situation we find ourselves at. But, of course, Iran has funded and trained and armed Hezbollah over the years to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth with very sophisticated advanced weaponry, state-of-the-art communications equipment, and so forth.
Well, I know that today there were, in certain areas of Lebanon where there are high concentrations of Sunnis, there were huge demonstrations against the formation of this government, and so perhaps there is still at least a political resistance that might put some of it in check. But as we have seen all too often in the Middle East, it is he with the hammer who controls